She was 19 years old, and she had been told, in the plainest language a man could assemble, that she was worth nothing and owned less than that. The man who had said it was her uncle, Clem Darby, who had taken guardianship of her following her mother's death in the spring of 1891 and who had, over the 14 months since, managed to sell off every piece of the Darby family property in Heron Falls, Kansas, the house, the mule, the kitchen garden, and the small savings her mother had kept in a tin behind the stovepipe, and convert all of it into whiskey and bad card games in the back room of the Linden Hotel. When the last dollar was gone, he had told Vera, standing in the empty front room of a house that no longer belonged to either of them, that she was old enough to fend for herself and that he was heading to Wichita, and he had walked out the door and she had not watched him go. She had $11. That was all. The old Prentice gristmill had been standing empty at the edge of Heron Falls for 7 years, ever since the Prentice family had pulled up and moved to Colorado, and the county had been trying to be rid of it at every tax auction since 1886 without success, because the mill race was silted, the roof had 2 holes you could push a hat through, and the great grinding wheel inside had seized so completely that the rumor around town was it had fused to its axle like a thing that had simply decided to be stoned forever. $9 was the county's ask. Every man at the auction that July morning laughed quietly to himself when the auctioneer called it. And nobody raised a hand. Nobody except a girl in a patched gray dress who had $11 and nowhere to sleep that night. What none of the laughing men knew, what Vera Darby herself would not discover until she had spent 3 days alone inside that dark and sagging building, was that something had been hidden in the rafters of the Prentice gristmill that the Prentice family had left behind not by accident but by a choice so desperate and so careful that it had survived 7 Kansas winters without anyone finding it. What was up there, wrapped in canvas and tucked between 2 hand-hewn beams, would not merely give Vera Darby a roof over her head. It would give the entire town of Heron Falls back something it did not know had been taken from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Vera Darby. If you have ever been told that what you have is not enough, that you yourself are not enough, we hope you will tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Vera's people had been millers. That is the first thing to understand, and it matters more than it might initially seem, because being a miller is not simply an occupation the way blacksmithing or storekeeping is an occupation. It is a relationship with a particular kind of physics. With water and weight and the patient conversion of one thing into another, and the families who work mills for generations develop, in the bones of their children, a feel for that relationship that is very difficult to acquire any other way. Vera's grandfather, August Darby, had operated a small flour mill on the Smoky Hill River in central Kansas from the time he arrived from Pennsylvania in 1859 until the drought of 1879 reduced the river to a trickle and the mill to a memory. He had not rebuilt. He had been too old by then, and the money was not there. But he had spent 20 years teaching his son everything he knew, and his son, Vera's father, Robert Darby, had spent the years of Vera's childhood teaching her. Robert Darby had never owned a mill of his own. He had worked as a miller's assistant in 3 different operations across central Kansas, moving the family when the work moved, settling in Heron Falls in 1883 when the Prentice mill was running full and Jacob Prentice needed a man who understood the machinery. Vera had been 11 years old when they arrived in Heron Falls, and she had spent the next 4 years of her life in and around the Prentice mill in a state of complete and uncomplicated happiness, because the mill was the most interesting place she had ever been, and because Jacob Prentice was a kind man who did not mind a girl asking questions, and because her father was at his best when he was working, and watching him at his best was one of the great pleasures of her childhood. She had learned everything in those 4 years. She had learned how a mill race worked, how the channel that diverted water from the stream needed to be maintained at a precise grade or the head pressure would drop and the wheel would slow. She had learned the language of a grinding wheel, how a properly dressed stone had a particular sound when it was running true, a low, even hum that settled into the chest, and how a stone that was running wrong announced its wrongness in 100 small ways before it announced it catastrophically. She had learned that the wooden machinery of a mill, the great shaft, the lantern gear, the wooden cogs that transferred the wheel's rotation to the grinding floor, was not simply mechanical but almost biological, that it required constant attention and a quality of listening that most men did not have the patience for. Her father had that patience, and he had passed it to her, and she had received it without knowing quite how valuable it was, the way children receive the best things their parents give them, not as gifts but simply as the texture of ordinary days. Robert Darby had died in the autumn of 1888, of a fever that came on in 3 days and did not leave. He had been 41 years old. Vera had been 16. Her mother, Frances, had worked as a seamstress and had kept them housed and fed in the years that followed, and Clem Darby, Robert's younger brother, who had never held a job longer than a season, and who drank with the focused commitment of a man who has decided that is his true vocation, had arrived uninvited in the spring of 1890, shortly before Frances's own health began its slow decline, and had installed himself in the front room with the air of a man who has finally found what he was looking for. Frances Darby had died in April of 1891, of a wasting illness that the doctor in Heron Falls called a weakness of the chest, and that Vera, who had watched her mother spend 18 months slowly diminishing under the weight of grief and worry, and the additional burden of Clem's presence, thought was more accurately described as a breaking of the heart. She was 19 years old at her mother's graveside. Clem Darby was 50 feet away, leaning against the cemetery fence with his hat pushed back, looking at the horizon with the expression of a man who is already thinking about the next thing. The next thing, as it turned out, was the money. Clem had presented himself to the probate court as Vera's legal guardian on the grounds that she was a minor female without a male relative of closer relation, and the court had accepted this with the efficiency of a system that did not look too hard at the men it handed young women to. Vera had understood immediately what was happening but had not had the legal standing to prevent it, and so she had watched, with the controlled stillness of a person who is saving their anger for a use, rather than wasting it on a gesture, while Clem sold the house to a family from Salina for $200, sold the mule to the livery for $12, sold her mother's sewing machine for $8, and spent the following 14 months converting all of it into the particular oblivion he had always been pursuing. She had tried, twice, to speak to the county clerk about her situation. The first time, the clerk had been sympathetic and useless. The second time, he had been neither. She had spoken to the minister of the Methodist Church, who had offered prayers and a sad expression. She had spoken to a woman named Delia Marsh, who ran the millinery on Linden Street and who had been her mother's only friend in Heron Falls, and Delia had given her supper twice a week throughout those 14 months. And had pressed coins into her palm when she could, and had told her, with a frankness Vera had been grateful for, that the law was what the law was, but that Clem Darby would run out of money before he ran out of town, and that on the day he did, Vera ought to be ready to move faster than he could. She had been ready. She had saved $11 over 14 months by taking in mending and by helping old Mr. Stull, who was mostly blind, with the reading of his correspondence, for which he paid her 25 cents a letter, and she had kept every cent in a small chamois pouch sewn into the lining of her coat where Clem would not find it if he looked, which he did not, because looking for things required a sustained attention he did not possess. On the morning Clem Darby walked out the door toward Wichita, Vera counted her $11, put on her coat, and walked to the county courthouse to find out when the next tax auction was scheduled. It was scheduled for that Thursday. The Prentice gristmill was the only item on the list. She had walked out to the mill the day before the auction, on a Wednesday afternoon when the light was long and gold and the heat of the Kansas summer was beginning to settle into something more bearable. The mill stood at the end of a rutted track off the Linden Road, set back from the dry creek bed that had once fed its mill race, surrounded by a growth of scrub sumac and prairie grass that had spent 7 years reclaiming the clearing. The building itself was 2 stories of limestone block on the lower half, and weathered board and batten above, with a roof that had once been sound cedar shingle and was now a patchwork of green moss and missing pieces and a bird's nest in the southeast corner that had been there long enough to become architectural. She stood in front of it for a long time, the way she had learned from her father to stand in front of a piece of machinery before you touched it, giving yourself time to see it whole, to read its posture, to understand what it was telling you before you imposed your own ideas on it. The building sagged at the roof line, but the limestone walls were true. The mill race was silted over, but the channel itself was intact, which meant it was cleanable. The wheel, she had walked around to the creek side to look at it, was seized and mossy, but the wood of it was white oak, and white oak that has been kept damp rather than allowed to dry and crack is very often sounder than it appears. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked back around to the door. The door was not locked. It had swollen in its frame enough to require her shoulder, but it opened. Inside, the mill smelled of old grain dust and dry wood and something faintly mineral, the smell of millstones, which does not leave a building even after the stones have stopped turning for 7 years, because it has worked itself into every surface and every beam. The light came in through the 2 roof holes and through the gaps in the board and batten siding in long, angled shafts full of floating dust, and in that light the interior of the old Prentice mill looked to Vera Darby less like a ruin than like a place that had been sleeping. She moved through it slowly, as her father had taught her, touching things as she went. The great shaft was intact. The lantern gear was dusty, but the wooden teeth were unbroken, which surprised her. She had expected to find damage there. The lower millstone, the bedstone, was in place and level. The upper stone, the runner, had slipped slightly on its axle, which was what had caused the seizing, and she saw in a moment that the slip was less catastrophic than the rumor had made it, that it was a matter of rekeying the axle, which was skilled work but not magical work, work that a person who knew mills could do. She was standing in the middle of the grinding floor, looking up at the underside of the upper story, when she saw it. The rafters of the Prentice mill were hand-hewn white oak, the same as the wheel, cut and fitted by whoever had built the original structure and added to over the years by the Prentice family as the building was expanded. They were massive beams, and they were dark with age, and running between 2 of them near the center of the span, where the shadows were deepest and where a person standing on the floor would have to be specifically looking to notice anything at all, was a length of canvas, folded and tied with cord, wedged into the gap between the beam and the wooden purlin that crossed it. It was not a large bundle. It had been placed there with deliberate care, pushed far enough into the shadow that it was invisible from the doorway and only barely visible from directly below. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked for a way up. There was a ladder on the far wall, its rungs intact, and she climbed it to the upper floor and made her way across the boards, testing each one before she trusted it, to the point above where she had seen the bundle. From up here she could reach the beam. She felt along it with her fingers until she found the canvas, and she worked it free from its position carefully. Because whatever was inside had been placed there with enough care that it deserved to be removed with care, and she carried it to the window opening in the upper wall where the light was better and sat down cross-legged on the dusty boards. She untied the cord. She unfolded the canvas. Inside was a leather satchel, old and dark with oil, the kind of satchel a man carries documents in. Inside the satchel was a collection of papers held together with a length of black ribbon, a stack perhaps an inch thick, and a small notebook with a marbled cover, the kind a bookkeeper uses, and a letter sealed with red wax that had been addressed, in a careful hand, to whoever finds this, may God have guided your hands to it. She read the letter first. It had been written by Jacob Prentice. She recognized the name, the man her father had worked for, the man who had been kind to a girl with questions, and it was dated September 14, 1884, which was 3 years before the Prentice family had left for Colorado and 7 years before this particular July afternoon. The letter explained, in the direct and undecorated language of a man who has spent his life working rather than writing, that he was hiding these papers because he had reason to believe that a man named Aldous Keach, who was the chairman of the Heron Falls Town Council and who controlled the Farmers Cooperative Bank on Mill Street, had been systematically defrauding the grain farmers of Heron Falls County for a period of not less than 6 years, and that the papers in the satchel were the evidence of that fraud, gathered over 2 years of quiet and careful record-keeping by Jacob Prentice himself and by his friend and neighbor Owen Shraft, who had worked the Shraft farm on the east side of the county and who had first noticed that the weights recorded for his grain deliveries at the cooperative elevator did not match the weights he recorded himself on his own scale at home. The fraud was specific and systematic. The cooperative's elevator scale, the scale used to weigh every bushel of grain brought in by every farming family in the county, had been adjusted. Not broken, not malfunctioning, but deliberately, precisely adjusted, so that it consistently read 4% below true weight. 4%. Sounds modest. 4% on 10,000 bushels of wheat at the going rate means 400 bushels of wheat that were credited to the farmers' accounts at zero because the scale said they did not exist, while the actual grain went into the cooperative's holdings, which were controlled by Aldous Keach, who was also, as the notebook made clear, with figures and dates and the names of shipment manifests, selling that surplus grain through a buyer in Abilene under the cooperative's name, and depositing the proceeds into an account at a bank in Topeka that had no connection to the farmers of Heron Falls County. The notebook was Owen Shraft's, filled with his own measurements and calculations and the dates on which he had cross-referenced his home scale against the cooperative scale and documented the discrepancy. The papers were manifests, account records, a copy of the cooperative's charter, and a series of letters between Keach and the Abilene buyer that Jacob Prentice had obtained. The letter did not say how, and which were explicit enough in their language about the arrangement that a child could have read them and understood what they described. Jacob Prentice had written that he and Owen Shraft had gone to the sheriff with their initial findings in the spring of 1884 and had been told that without more documentation their claims could not be acted upon, and that the Following week Aldous Keach had called in Owen Schraft's operating loan. A loan that Schraft had held at the cooperative bank for 11 years. Without a single missed payment, and Schraft had been forced to sell his farm and leave the county by autumn. Jacob Prentice had written that he understood what that meant, and that he had spent the summer gathering as much additional documentation as he could, and that he intended to take it to a lawyer in Topeka rather than the local sheriff, but that he did not trust his own house to keep it safe because Keach was the kind of man who had friends who did things, and that the mill was the only place he could think of where it would be secure while he made his arrangements. He had never made his arrangements. He had fallen ill in the winter of 1884 and had not recovered his full strength, and by 1887 he had decided that Colorado was a better prospect for a sick man than Kansas, and he had left, quickly, quietly, without returning to the mill for the satchel, perhaps intending to send for it later, perhaps simply too diminished by illness and defeat to carry the weight of it any further. Owen Schraft was gone. The evidence was in the Rafters. And Aldous Keach had continued as chairman of the town council and president of the Farmers Cooperative Bank of Heron Falls for 7 additional years, which meant, Vera calculated as she sat in the window opening of the upper floor with the papers spread across her knees, that the farmers of Heron Falls County had been losing 4% of every grain delivery for not less than 13 years. She read through every document twice before the afternoon light began to change. The letters between Keach and the Abilene buyer were written in the coded shorthand of men who know they are doing wrong but have been doing it so long they no longer feel the need to disguise it carefully, references to the surplus grain as the overage, to the Topeka account as the secondary arrangement, to the farmers themselves as the source material, which was a phrase so cold and so deliberate that Vera had to set that particular letter down for a moment and breathe before she picked it up again. The manifest copies were annotated in Owen Schraft's round, careful hand with comparison figures. What the cooperative scale recorded, what his own measurements showed. At home, the difference calculated to the penny and then totaled at the bottom of each page in a column that grew longer and more damning as the months of his record-keeping accumulated. There were pages and pages of it, meticulous and heartbreaking in the way that honest arithmetic always is when it is being used to document dishonesty, because the numbers do not editorialize, they simply accumulate, and the accumulation in Owen Schraft's little notebook was the record of a quiet man spending 2 years of his life proving in the most careful way he knew how that he was being robbed. She thought about Owen Schraft, whom she had never met and did not know. She thought about what it must have cost him, the early mornings at his own scale before the grain wagons left, the evenings cross-referencing the cooperative's manifests against his own figures, the slow and sickening growth of certainty that the number was wrong, and with it the dread of what that certainty would require of him. She thought about the trip to the sheriff, 2 men walking into an office, hats in hand, carrying months of careful work, and walking back out with nothing but the knowledge that the system they had trusted to protect them was not going to. She thought about the letter calling in Owen Schraft's loan, the farm sale, the departure. She thought about Jacob Prentice, sick and tired and grieving the loss of his friend and neighbor, climbing this same ladder with this satchel under his arm and wedging it between these same beams in the fading light of a September afternoon in 1884, climbing back down, closing the mill door, and driving west. Leaving it for whoever might come after, if anyone came at all. She sat with that number, 13 years, for a long time. She was not a woman given to dramatic reactions, that was not how her family had taught her to receive difficult information. She sat with it the way she sat with Everything that mattered, quietly and completely, until she understood it from all its angles and what each angle asked of her, and then she began to think about what to do. The problem was this: she was 19 years old, she was female, she was effectively homeless, she had no money beyond the $2 remaining from her 11, and the man she needed to expose had been the most powerful figure in Heron Falls for over a decade. The county sheriff had already been tested by 2 honest men and found insufficient. The local lawyer, a man named Bertram Holt, had his office in the same building as the Farmers Cooperative Bank, which told Vera everything she needed to know about his independence. When she brought the matter to Bertram Holt directly, presenting herself at his office door with the satchel under her arm and asking for a consultation, he had looked at her for a long moment, at her age, at her patched dress, at the fact of her being what she was and not what he was accustomed to taking seriously, and had told her that documents found in an abandoned building by someone with no legal standing in the county were not likely to form the basis of a viable claim, and that she might consider whether pursuing this was the wisest use of her time and resources, and the way he said resources made clear that he was aware she had none. He had not been rude. Men like Bertram Holt were rarely rude. They simply arranged their sentences so that you understood your position without them having to state it directly, which was a skill Vera recognized and did not admire. She left his office without argument, which surprised him, she thought. Though he did not show it. She had learned from 14 months of living under Clem Darby's roof that argument was not always the best use of a woman's energy when the person she was arguing with had already decided not to hear her. Delia Marsh, when Vera came to her the evening of the day she found the papers, listened to the whole account without interrupting and then Saturday in silence for a moment and then said, with the precision of a woman who has spent her life navigating the world as it actually is rather than as it presents itself, you need someone outside this county, and you need a farmer who is still here and still angry. The farmer was not hard to find. There were many of them. The difficulty was finding one who was angry in a useful rather than simply a discouraged direction, one who had noticed the discrepancy, who had records of his own, who had not been so beaten down by 13 years of slow theft that he had lost the will to name it. Vera found him in a man named Cuthbert Rains, who farmed 300 acres on the north side of the county and who had kept his own scale records for 12 years out of a habit of precision. That had nothing to do with suspicion and everything to do with character, and who, when Vera spread Jacob Prentice's papers on his kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with Delia Marsh sitting beside her, read everything in a complete silence that lasted 20 minutes and then looked up and said, in a voice that was very quiet and very flat, that he had always known the number was wrong but had never been able to prove it, and what did she need from him? What she needed was his records and his name on a letter to the state banking examiner's office in Topeka, because a letter from a 19-year-old girl with no property would not be read with the same attention as a letter from an established farmer with 12 years of documented scale records. Cuthbert Rains wrote the letter that night. 3 other farmers. Men Rains brought to the table over the following week, men who had their own scale books and their own quiet arithmetic of loss, signed it with him. Vera organized the evidence into a clear and sequential account, because she had her mother's precision with written things and her father's instinct for what mattered in a complex system, and the document she assembled was not the work of a girl who did not know what she was doing. The banking examiner arrived from Topeka in August. He was a thin, methodical man named Herschel Prudhomme who had the manner of someone who has seen this particular kind of thing before and is not surprised by it but is made no less thorough by his lack of surprise. He spent 4 days in Heron Falls examining the cooperative's books against The evidence in Prentice's satchel and against the farmer's own records, and at the end of those 4 days he filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office that resulted, by October, in the arrest of Aldous Keach on charges of fraud and embezzlement and the appointment of a receiver to manage the farmers' cooperative bank while the full extent of the loss was calculated. The calculation, when it was completed, was staggering. 13 years of 4% across the grain volume of Heron Falls County came to a figure that made Cuthbert Rains sit down heavily in a chair when he heard it, and that made the four farmers who had signed the letter grip each other's arms in the way that men who do not otherwise touch each other sometimes do when the thing they have been carrying is finally put down. There were families in that county who had lost their farms in drought years when a 4% recovery on their grain earnings might have been the margin between survival and ruin. There were men who had taken loans they would not have needed if the scale had been true. The receiver began the work of sorting out what could be recovered and restored, and it was slow and imperfect and did not make anyone completely whole, because theft never fully unwound by an accounting process, but it was something, and in Heron Falls it was called something. Vera spent the autumn of 1891 doing 2 things. She spent her mornings working on the Prentice mill, cleaning the mill race, rekeying the axle of the runner stone, replacing the worst of the roof shingles with cedar she bought on credit from the lumber yard in town, whose owner had heard enough of the story to extend her the courtesy. She spent her afternoons at Cuthbert Rains's kitchen table or at Delia Marsh's millinery or wherever the work of documentation and testimony required her. She did not think of these as separate activities. They were both, in their different ways, the same work, the restoration of something that had been allowed to fall into disrepair by the inattention and the avarice of people who should have known better. The mill made its first grinding run on a Saturday in November, when the mill race was clean and the creek was running with the first of the autumn rains, and the great white oak wheel, which had been seized so thoroughly that the men of Heron Falls had declared it fused forever, began to turn again under the weight of water in the old channel, slowly at first, and then with gathering purpose, and then with the full deep rhythm that Vera Darby had last heard when she was 15 years old, standing beside her father in this same building, listening to the voice of the stones. It was the sound she had carried in her chest for 4 years without knowing she was carrying it, and when it came again she stood in the middle of the grinding floor with her eyes closed and let it fill her completely, and she did not cry, because crying was not what the moment called for. The moment called for listening, and she listened. We think about Vera Darby in the way you think about a person whose life teaches you something you did not have words for before you heard the story. She was 19 years old and she had $11, and she bought a mill that every person in Heron Falls had decided was beyond saving, and inside it she found not only the evidence that gave her community back what had been stolen from it, but the thing she had needed most, a purpose that was equal to her ability, and a place where that ability could be used. She was 19 years old, and she had been told she was worth nothing and owned less than that. And what we keep coming back to, in the telling of this story, is that the person who told her that was wrong in a way that goes deeper than just the money. He was wrong about the nature of worth itself. Worth is not what you possess at a given moment. It is what you know, and what you can do with what you know, and whether you have the patience and the courage and the structural attention to see what is actually in front of you rather than what the world has decided is there. Vera had all of those things. She had gotten them in a grinding room and on a river bank and at a father's side and in 14 months of controlled, purposeful waiting. She had brought them to a derelict building in a Kansas summer, and she had climbed a ladder, and she had found the thing that was waiting to be found, and she had known what to do with it. Clem Darby, we are told, made it as far as Wichita before the money ran out entirely. He wrote to Vera once, in the winter of 1892, asking for assistance. She was, by then, operating a functioning gristmill and serving as a named witness in the state's case against Aldous Keach, and she was living in the miller's quarters on the ground floor of the Prentice building, and she had, for the first time in 4 years, enough to eat every day and a roof that did not have holes in it. And she wrote back to Clem a letter of 3 sentences that said she was well and that she wished him the same and that she had nothing to send him. It was the truest letter she had ever written. The mill ran under Vera's hand for 9 years, until she sold it in 1900 to a young family named Beckett, who had come to Heron Falls from Iowa and who wanted to be millers and whom she spent 3 months teaching everything her father had taught her, because that is what you do with the things that have been given to you in love, you give them forward. The rafters of the old Prentice mill are still there. The building still stands, or it did the last time anyone recorded it, in a county history published in 1923, which noted it as the site of a notable moment in local justice and named, in passing, the young woman who had purchased it for $9 on a July morning when every man at the auction had been too certain of his own judgment to look twice. We are so glad you found your way to this story today, and we hope it stays with you in the way that honest things do. Not loudly, but with a steady weight that means something. If this moved you, share it with someone who could use a reminder that overlooked things carry their value with them, whether or not anyone is paying attention. And we have one question for you as you go: what is something or someone that the world once told you was not worth much, and turned out to matter more than anyone had said? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.